Hello, everyone, and welcome to this discussion on Russia's parliamentary election featuring Vladimir Kara-Murza, who is a Russian activist, politician, Washington Post contributor, and documentary filmmaker. We are distinctly honored to host Vladimir for this event, which is co-sponsored by the European and Eurasian Studies program at the Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs at Florida International University, together with the Institute on Russia at the University of South Florida. My name is Golfo Alexopoulos. I'm director of the USF Institute on Russia, and I'm joined by David Kramer, who is director of FIU's European and Eurasian Studies program. We'll begin with the speakers' opening remarks and a moderated discussion, followed by questions from the audience, so please feel free to submit your questions at any time. I'll now turn things over to David, who will introduce our speaker, Vladimir Kara-Murza.
Golfo, thanks so much, and it's great to partner with you and USF and the Institute for Russia. I want to welcome everyone here on behalf of FIU and the Green School and its European and Eurasian Studies program. And we are thrilled to have with us today an old friend, Vladimir Kara-Murza, who is joining us today from DC, but will be heading back to Moscow before too long. Vladimir, as Golfo mentioned, is one of the leading experts and activists on Russia, a columnist for the Washington Post, and he also is chair of the Boris Nemtsov Foundation. He was very close to the late opposition leader, Boris Nemtsov, who tragically was assassinated in February 2015. And Vladimir has himself endured terrible threats to his life, having survived miraculously 2 poisonings, one in 2015, another in 2017. He's been profiled on 60 Minutes, among many other places. And Golfo and I thought he would be the perfect person to lead us in a discussion here today about Russia's Douma, quote unquote, and we put this deliberately in quotation marks, elections, neither free nor fair. So without further ado, Vladimir, thanks so much for joining us. The floor is yours, and then we'll have Q&A. And if folks want to, we have the Q&A function for you to send in your questions. Thanks.
Thank you so much, David. Thank you, Golf. And I want to, first of all, thank the University of South Florida and Florida International University for making this conversation possible, and for all of you who have joined us in this discussion today. I think one of the features of Russian, previously Soviet life is that the worse political repression gets in our country, the better the political jokes become, because that's the only avenue often for people to sort of have their feelings expressed. And so one of the most prominent jokes from the 1970s, from late Brezhnev era, was, in the morning, a Communist Party official walks into the office and he sees the first secretary running around the room in panic, tearing his hair out. And the official asks, well, Comrade First Secretary, what happened? And he said, somebody broke in during the night into the safe and stole all the election results. And he said, well, Comrade, not to worry, that they're all published in newspapers. We can get them back. And the First Secretary said, you don't understand. They stole the results of next year's elections. And unfortunately, as with so many other things, political jokes are returning to our country with the height of political repression. And this one has also made its comeback. This is the sad situation today, that we are just over 2 weeks before what is supposed to be our parliamentary election. And in normal circumstances, in countries with normal free political systems, we will be discussing opinion polls and the chances of various parties and candidates. Instead, unfortunately, in my country, we have to discuss, how many political opponents are in prison, how many are in exile, and how many have been prevented, even theoretically, from seeking any elected office. This process didn't begin yesterday. It began almost immediately after Vladimir Putin came to power, now almost 22 years ago, at the end of 1999. I think that in itself is an important fact to remember, and it's actually a big reason for the shifts in public opinion that we're seeing in Russia today, and I'm going to be speaking about in a minute. We now have, people in Russia who were born, went to kindergarten, went to school, went to college, and are now beginning their adult professional lives, and all this while one and the same man has stayed in power. You in America have had 5 presidents of different parties. And all this time, we've just had the same face on our television screens. And this is an important factor in what we'll be talking about in a minute, but this was a gradual process that began in 22 or a little less than that years ago. And when David said at the beginning that we put the word election when we talk about elections in Vladimir Putin's Russia in quotation marks, I think it's important to say at the outset that this is not our opinion, mine, David's, or Golfo's. This is actually a very clear public and official conclusion from the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE, the world's largest security-oriented international organization, 57 member states, including the United States of America, an organization, of course, that is founded on very clear commitments with respect to democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. And one of the main tasks of the OSCE is to monitor its member states' compliance with democratic standards for holding elections and referenda. These standards have been outlined and signed up to by member states, including the US, including Russia, with the 1990 OSCE Copenhagen document. And every time there are national elections in participating states of the OSCE, this goes for the United States as well, the OSCE sends teams of observer missions to both long-term and short-term to make assessments. And at the end of this process, they publish very detailed and comprehensive reports as to how these elections went. And you can go on the OSCE website and look at all these reports for every single OSCE member states, again, including, for example, the latest US election in 2020 with very detailed analysis and assessment. The last time the OSCE, and this really is the gold standard for election observation in Europe and North America, the last time the OSCE has assessed a Russian parliamentary election as being free, fair, competitive, and democratic was in December of 1999. This was just before Vladimir Putin came to power. Not a single election since, parliamentary or presidential, has met even the basic minimum standards of democracy, competition, and fairness. And this was a gradual process. Also, it didn't happen overnight. I remember well, for example, the sort of, in many ways, the turning point election that was held in 2003. I was a candidate myself for the Russian parliament in that election, running for the democratic opposition in Moscow. And this was a turning point election in many ways from the imperfect democracy we had before Putin came to power to the perfect authoritarian system that he has built in Russia under his rule. It was famously assessed by OSCE and Council of Europe observers as being, and I quote, free, but certainly not fair, end of quote. It was still free in a sense that people like myself, for example, could still be candidates running for elected office, something that is inconceivable today. But of course, the conditions were prearranged such that it was not possible for us to win. And that was that election in 2003 resulted in the Russian parliament being cleansed of the last remaining opposition parties. This was the time when the pro-democracy parties led by Boris Nemtsov, whom David mentioned, my longtime friend and colleague, and Grigory Yavlinsky, the other pro-democracy party in Russia, Yabloko, were both kicked out of the Russian parliament using fraudulent means. Since then, things have continued to go downhill. For a while, it was possible for the Putin regime to maintain its political dominance using, what we could call, quote unquote, traditional authoritarian methods. Control of the media. This was the first thing Putin made sure of when he came to power. Within the first 3 years of his rule, all independent television networks in Russia were either shut down or brought under the control of the state. The use of administrative resources, where you would have the whole power of the government, both on the national and the regional and the local level, being used in support of pro-regime candidates, them getting all the administrative advantages and the opposition candidates having their campaign literature taken off, not being allowed in the media, and so on. They then, of course, reverted to another favorite tool of dictatorships, just, plain old election fraud. And we saw that most prominently in 2011, when, according to independent estimates, up to 14 million votes were fraudulently added to the total of Vladimir Putin's United Russia party. Of course, everybody remembers that year because those fraudulent elections were followed by the largest street protests under Vladimir Putin's rule, when we had in excess of 120,000 people demonstrating on the streets of downtown Moscow, calling for a rerun and a free and fair election and for Putin to resign. But with time, as that fatigue grew, and this is where I want to go back to what I said at the beginning, that we've had a whole generation in Russia now that doesn't remember anything, any political reality except Vladimir Putin's, that has grown and that have spent their whole lives watching that one and the same face on television screens. I'm old enough to remember those free and fair elections that Russia had back in the 90s. There are now people who can only read about that in history books, who've never witnessed a free election in their lives. And so more than anything else, it is that growing fatigue with a 2-decade single man rule that is leading to this market shift in public opinion that we are seeing happening in Russia now. According to the latest polls, and by the way, when we talk about opinion polls in an authoritarian regime, we have to take it with a big caveat for obvious reasons. Many people, first of all, lack access to objective information. I mentioned the total state control of television, but also a lot of people, for the reasons you wouldn't find surprising, would be hesitant to share their political opinion, especially if they're opposed to the government, with a stranger who approaches them on the street. But even given those caveats, the latest poll figures that we see, and this is literally from the last few days, Vladimir Putin's party, United Russia, the ruling party, whose list in this election, quote unquote, is headed by Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu and Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, names that would be familiar to our audience, in a very clear symbolism too, that this is the face of the Putin regime, this aggressive nature, not just the domestic repression against our own people in Russia, but also the aggressive face turned towards the rest of the world. So United Russia Party, the party of Vladimir Putin, whose list is led by Putin's defense minister and Putin's foreign minister, is down to 26% in the polls nationwide and down to 15%, 1-5, in the city of Moscow. These are, I have to say, shameful figures for a regime that controls absolutely everything. National television, administrative machine, the whole government apparatus, the whole political life, 26% nationally and 15% in Moscow. And so you wouldn't be surprised by the fact that the last resort that the Kremlin has to try to preserve its political dominance is to actually eliminate any kind of opposition ahead of time. So even before we get to the campaign, even before we get to the vote count, all of these old-fashioned authoritarian methods that I've used, that I've mentioned before, will be very much in use again this year. And I'll speak about some of them in a minute as well. But the most important tool that the Kremlin has at its disposal is the artificial elimination of the opposition. This is very important. This is the central method in the whole survival, in the whole continuing existence of Vladimir Putin's political regime, is the artificial elimination of the opposition. Every time I still hear, and I'm still amazed that I still hear this sometimes, but from well-informed and sometimes prominent Western analysts or journalists say that, yes, Vladimir Putin's regime is problematic. There are many criticisms can be leveled against it. But what can we say? It's popular among the people of Russia. Look, they keep winning elections. And first of all, I'm always amazed that I still hear things like this from serious people. But most importantly, I always pose the question of, do you think it's difficult to win an election when your opponents are not on the ballot? And so that is the central and the most effective method that the Kremlin uses to keep its political dominance. And we are seeing this in full force in this so-called election. Again, the other methods are still there. Total control of the media, full use of administrative government resources. We are very likely to see massive fraud again. And actually one of the sort of best illustrations of that coming fraud was the fact that this year, for the first time ever in the history of elections in modern Russia, there will not be an OSCE observer mission monitoring these elections because the Kremlin has effectively sabotaged the OSCE mission. One of the main tenets of the OSCE election observation mechanism is that it is the organization that decides on the size, the format, and the scope of the observer mission. Needless to say, a country that is being observed cannot dictate who observes it. And so that has been the central principle going back years and decades. And so the OSCE decided that it needs to send a mission together, both short-term and long-term, a mission of 500 election monitors to Russia. In my view, that's a pitifully small number for a country of 140 million people, the largest country in the world territorially. 500 people, that's what the OSCE wanted. The Kremlin said, no, you can only have 60. First, that's actually even beyond ridiculous. Also, that's a direct violation of OSCE rules. Of course, they used the COVID excuse, and I think this is one of the most hypocritical sort of aspects of the current behavior of the Putin regime, when they needed to get 80,000 people recently into Moscow's Luzhniki Stadium to celebrate the anniversary of the annexation of Crimea. No COVID, no problem. But if you have a one-man picket, literally one person standing with a poster or for an opposition picket in Moscow, that person gets arrested for breaking COVID regulations. And I'm not joking. I don't know who they're supposed to infect, the poster or I don't know whom, but that is the reality. And so, of course, under the pretext of COVID, which is just a brilliant excuse for a lot of authoritarian regimes around the world today, not just Putin's, they have effectively sabotaged the OSCE mission by demanding that it be reduced by 9 times. So the OSCE had to say that in these conditions we will simply be unable to carry out our election observation mission. So this can point to very high likelihood of massive fraud that we will see in the election this year, and this fraud will be made easier again by another sort of COVID pretexted change in the rules. Usually before, our elections would be held over one day. So you have the election day, then you have the night of the count, and observers would be present both for the election day and for the night of the count. What we're going to be seeing this year is that the election will be held over 3 days. So it's going to begin on September 17th, then carry on September the 18th. Then the final day will be September the 19th, and then the vote count after that. And so, of course, observers will be present for all 3 voting days, 8 a.m. to 8 p.m., as well as the third final night of the count. But for the first 2 nights, as soon as it's 8 p.m., thank you for your service. See you tomorrow morning. And then we'll have 2 nights, 2 times, but 12 hours to do whatever they want with the ballots that will be in those boxes. And so this is why we in the opposition are calling for our supporters to turn out on the last day, September the 19th, because at least this is some small measure of protection to make sure that your ballots are not just simply exchanged, which is very likely to happen. But back to the central question, participation and competition. There was an expert report recently published by Golos, meaning Voice or Vote, which is the leading independent election monitoring NGO in Russia. That was, by the way, 2 weeks ago designated by the Kremlin as a quote-unquote foreign agent, which is the fate of basically all remaining independent NGOs and civil society groups in Russia. They came up with an expert report a few weeks ago, estimating the total number of Russian citizens who are even formally not allowed to contest any elections at any level to stand at 9 million people. This report was called Novые Lishentsy, the new Lishentsy. Lishentsy is a term from the early Soviet period, the 1920s, coming from the word lishit, to deprive, meaning the people who are deprived of electoral rights. In the early years of the Soviet rule in the 1920s and 30s, people who belonged to for example, the nobility, the clergy, the entrepreneurial class, the military officers of the former Imperial Army, these people would be deprived of even formal electoral rights in the Soviet Union. And according to official figures, in 1927, the total number of people who were deprived of their electoral rights formally stood at 3 million people. At the time, that was about 4% of the total adult population. Today, according to Golos's estimates, we have 9 million people who are even formally deprived of the right to stand for election. That's about 8 or 9% of the adult population, so twice as many people in percentage terms. And this includes, for example, anybody who's been convicted for participating in a quote-unquote unauthorized demonstration. That's Kremlin speak for opposition rallies. My friend and colleague Yulia Galyamina, who was planning to run for a seat in the Douma in Moscow, was disqualified on this grounds. This now includes everybody who is even remotely in any way associated with Aleksei Navalny and his movement. Aleksei Navalny, of course, being the most prominent political opponent of Vladimir Putin's regime, who was poisoned last year with a chemical nerve agent by the same FSB officers who had poisoned me previously, as David mentioned. This was subject of an extensive investigation conducted by the Bellingcat Media Group. You can find that investigation published online, and who is now imprisoned and recognized by human rights groups and international organizations as a political prisoner. He's a leading political opponent of Vladimir Putin. Not only is he himself, Aleksei Navalny himself, prevented, obviously, from seeking any elected office, but anyone even remotely associated with him or his movement or his regional movements around the country is banned from participating. And this was done by a law that was signed by Vladimir Putin just before the start of the election campaign. In fact, it was signed on the 4th of June, which is the birthday of Aleksei Navalny. This is how this regime likes to do things. David mentioned at the beginning of our conversation the assassination in February of 2015 of our mutual friend Boris Nemtsov, the leader of the Russian opposition, who was gunned down literally under the Kremlin walls. And to this day, the organizers and masterminds of his assassination continue to enjoy full immunity at the hands of the Russian state for reasons you wouldn't be surprised to hear. Last year, there was a landmark oversight report prepared actually also by the OSCE and published on its website, detailing the entire chain of command, going from the perpetrators, from the lowest perpetrators who are currently in a Russian prison. Those are the subordinates of Kremlin-appointed Chechen leader Ramzan Kadyrov, and going all the way to Vladimir Putin. And the OSCE report details, based on witness testimony, exactly when, where, and how Putin gave the order for that assassination. But the point I'm making is that the symbolism of this, the law banning Navalny supporters from seeking elected office was signed on Navalny's birthday. Last year, Vladimir Putin signed a decree giving a state medal, state award to the senator from Chechnya, Suleiman Gerimeyev, who's one of the people involved in the assassination of Boris Nemtsov. He's also named by name in the OSCE report. Putin signed that decree on February 27th, the anniversary of the assassination of Boris Nemtsov. This is how this regime does things. It's about symbols as well. And so this law against Navalny supporters was signed by Putin on Navalny's birthday, June the 4th of this year. And if you read the language of that law, it defines almost anybody could be defined as a Navalny supporter. If you ever, let's say, put a like on YouTube to the, for example, the investigative video that Navalny's team put out earlier this year about Vladimir Putin's lavish $1.5 billion palace on the Black Sea, and there were millions of views, more than 100 million views, and a lot of, quite a few million likes as well. Anybody who put a like on that YouTube, if you read the language of that law, that could be construed as being a supporter of Aleksei Navalny. If you donated 100 rubles to any of the Navalny organizations a year ago, and yes, you're not mistaken, a year ago, before the law was passed, this law is retroactive. If you donated 100 rubles to any of the Navalny organizations a year ago, you're affected by that law. You're not allowed to run for any elected office. If you ever attended a rally in support of Aleksei Navalny, and there were hundreds of thousands of Russians who attended those rallies earlier this year all around the country in January, you will not be allowed to run for elected office, and so on and so forth. Many, many other bans introduced by Putin's regime for people running for elected office. For example, if you hold dual citizenship, you're not allowed to run anymore. If you ever studied abroad and hold a residence permit in another country, for example, you're not allowed to run, and so on. I can carry on, but these are millions of people. And so the end result of that is that there will be almost no opposition on the ballot to Putin's regime when we have our quote-unquote election in 2 weeks' time. I say almost because there is one remaining exception. Well, first of all, of course, we have to say that this is not the system is not as straightforward as it was in Soviet times. I mentioned United Russia, Vladimir Putin's party. Well, in fact, there are 4 parties in the Russian State Duma. So technically, we have a quote-unquote multi-party system. Of course, all of those parties are fully supportive of the Putin regime. And suffice to look at, for example, last year's vote on the constitutional amendments, in effect making Putin president for life, that was carried, those amendments were carried in a Duma unanimously, with not a single vote in opposition. So that's the fake multi-party system we have. And so apart from United Russia, these are the Communist Party, the misnamed Liberal Democratic Party that is actually on the extreme right, and so-called Just Russia, a party that now includes infamously some of the people who have been leading the armed insurgency in the Donbass against Ukraine in past years, Zakhar Pilepin and others. So those are the sort of the 4 parties, the 4 parts of Putin's ruling system. But I say there is an exception, because there remains one genuine opposition party, the last remnant of our brief experiment with democracy back in the 90s, that still has ballot access. That party is Yabloko. That is a liberal party, and I'm using European terminology. Liberal, for us in Europe means something a little different than you mean liberal in America, but basically pro-democracy, a party that stands for freedom of the media, for freedom of assembly, for free elections, for Russia to become a normal, modern, democratic European country. That's what the party stands for. Oh, and I should say straight away that I'm not a member of it, so I'm not speaking here with any vested interest, just sort of as an outside observer in this case. Actually, as David mentioned, I've worked for years with Boris Nemtsov, so I was always in that there were 2 major pro-democracies party in Russia: Union of Right Forces, later became the People's Freedom Party, sort of on the one side of the pro-democracy spectrum, and Yabloko on the other. I was always on the Union of Right Forces or People's Freedom Party spectrum. Yabloko were always friends, but also competitors in that spectrum. But they are the only ones who remain. They are publicly outspoken about all the things that are red flags for the Putin regime, frankly. For example, the annexation of Crimea, they call it what it is, an unlawful annexation. You wouldn't hear anybody else on the Russian political spectrum say that. They're against the war in Ukraine. They're against the aggressive posturing, the wars, the besieged fortress mentality, everything that Putin's regime represents, or needless to say, against political repressions, political murders, and political prisoners. So they have come out openly against both the domestic repressions and the external aggressions that have come to symbolize and define the Putin regime in the last 20 years. And they still retain the ballot access, but with two important caveats. First, and I should say the reason they still retain ballot access is because they have elected members in regional legislatures in a few Russian regions, still in the regions where support for the opposition is so high that even when there is fraud, a few people can still make it past that barrier. So those examples are Moscow, St. Petersburg, and Pskov and Karelia, actually Pskov and Karelia being the two regions in the northwest of Russia near the border with Finland and the Baltic states. So they do have ballot access. They still, people will see them on the ballot. But as I mentioned, with two important caveats. One, in the last 2 weeks, including actually the latest example today, many of the Yabloko candidates who have already been registered for the ballot are being taken off retroactively. So I'm guessing the authorities are looking at the internal polling in those districts and are seeing which candidates are likely to win, and they're finding excuses to take them off. One of the most prominent examples last week, a good friend of mine, Lev Schlossberg, who is a legislator in Pskov, who came to national prominence initially with his public criticism of the adoption ban. You remember in 2012, after the United States passed the Magnitsky Act, bringing visa bans and asset freezes against individual human rights abusers, the Putin regime responded with a blanket ban on American citizens adopting Russian orphans. It was, even those of us who are in opposition to Putin, frankly, it was mind-boggling to see the level of cynicism and just disregard for human life that this regime would sing. But this is exactly what they did. And so Schlossberg first came to national prominence. He used to be a purely regional politician before, but he came to national prominence with his criticism of that law. And then even more prominently in 2014, with his criticism of the war in Eastern Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea. And it wasn't just words. He used to be the editor of a local newspaper in Pskov. And his newspaper found and published took photographs of the graves of serving Russian military officers who were killed in Eastern Ukraine. And of course, the Kremlin would say, oh, there are no Russian troops in Ukraine. These are just some local separatist volunteers. They found proof, documentary evidence that there were regular Russian troops in Ukraine. And so you can imagine a prospect of having somebody like this in the Russian parliament is obviously unwelcome for the Kremlin regime. But 10 days ago, this was before Schlossberg was taken off the ballot. I went to see his headquarters. This is in the northwest of Moscow, where he was running in a district. You had a team of young, dedicated volunteers. You could see the enthusiasm. You could see the support that people would just show on the street. Last week, he was taken off the ballot because in January of this year, he attended a rally in protest of the arrest of Aleksei Navalny. This is just an illustration of how this law is used. So he was taken off the ballot. Several other members of Yabloko were taken off the ballot, including one today, again, for the same thing, for having attended a rally, I think also in January. And we still have, I think it's 5 days before the election starts. So up until September the 12th, they are still allowed to take candidates off the ballot. So we are today in September the 2nd, they still have 10 days. So I think we'll see a lot of opposition candidates who will not make it to the ballot in these coming 10 days. And then the second caveat I should mention also is that in what was also a very symbolic move, but in a good way, unlike what the Putin regime is doing, one of the candidates for the Douma on the Yabloko list is Andrei Pivavaro. He is a political prisoner, one of the nearly 400 internationally recognized political prisoners in Vladimir Putin's Russia. He used to head the Open Russia movement founded by exiled Putin critic Mikhail Khodorkovsky. He was a director of that movement. Because of that, he was arrested, and he's currently in pretrial detention in Krasnodar in south of Russia under yet another new repressive law on so-called undesirable organizations. He's facing up to 6 years in prison for making a Facebook post in August of 2020. This is the reality of Vladimir Putin's Russia. And so in a symbolic move to express their support for him as a political prisoner, Yabloko nominated Andrei Pivavaro as a candidate. So he's a candidate on their list. So what the authorities then did, they designated Andrei Pivavaro as a foreign agent. I mentioned it's done often to people who oppose this regime and to independent civil society groups. And because Yabloko now has a quote unquote foreign agent on their list, all of their campaign materials, all of their TV ads, internet ads, leaflets, newspapers, t-shirts that the volunteers wear, every time they appear on TV, the information about them on the ballot, on the information posters in every polling place when the election happens, is being labeled by the authorities in massive caps lock letters in a black font that this is a party affiliated with a foreign agent. And I have to say, even after everything that we've experienced in Russia, it's pretty mind-boggling to see that every time we have these TV debates now going on before the election, and every time any Yabloko candidate tries to speak, the presenter interrupts them and reads out the message, and you can also see it in bold font and caps lock on half of your screen that this is a party affiliated with a foreign agent. And so this is what people will see when they take up their ballots on September 17th or 18th or 19th. But again, we urge people to go on the last day. Many other things we could discuss with regard to the elections, and I look forward to the question and answer session. I just want to say one short thing in conclusion. 2 weeks ago, Angela Merkel, the German chancellor, the outgoing German chancellor, was in Moscow for her farewell visit. And they had a press conference with Putin at the end of the meeting. And she once again publicly called for the release of Aleksei Navalny and other political prisoners. Putin once again said that they're not going to do that. And one thing he said was that, talking about Navalny and responding to Merkel's call for his release, he said, Russia has had enough revolutions and we do not want another one. This was the phrase he used. And, I happen to be a historian by education. And I think if somebody uses history as reference, it would actually be a good idea to know it. And the reason, I actually agree that we have too many revolutions in our history, but the reason we had them in all three revolutions that happened in Russia in the 20th century, 1905 and 1917, actually, and then again in 1991, which just marked the 30th anniversary of that revolution, all of them happened because society lacked any normal democratic means, not just to influence government policy, but even just to have its voice heard. This was the reason people had to take it out on the streets, because they couldn't do it through the ballot. And so if Putin thinks that by rendering elections totally controlled and totally meaningless, as he has done, he's going to prevent another revolution, I think he is in for a big surprise. So thank you very much again for this opportunity. I look forward to your questions and then to questions from our audience.
Great, Vladimir, thanks so much. And just a reminder, we're already getting some great questions in. Please keep sending them. Golfo and I will go back and forth with the question or two each, and then we'll open it up to the audience questions. My first question follows on a question actually Bob Otto sent in. Why does the regime bother to hold Douma elections at all? Whom does it think it's fooling by holding these elections? And then the flip side of that question is, why would the opposition participate at all in these elections if they were so badly rigged?
Thank you, David. Two fundamental questions. First, on the regime side, well, we live in the 21st century, and the only acceptable form of legitimacy in the 21st century is through the ballot box. Even authoritarian regimes sort of half recognize that, and this is why they put up the spectacle. This is what they put up the show. I mean, Putin's regime is obviously by no means the only authoritarian regime that puts up with the spectacle. We see the same in Belarus and Venezuela and all these other systems that are so similar to what Putin has built, because that's the exercise you have to go through to maintain this legitimacy. And by the way, the flip side of this is that I think it is high time, finally. I mean, it's long overdue, but it's high time certainly now for the international community, for the world's democracies, to finally deny that recognition of the legitimacy. to which the Putin regime has no claim and no right, because again, the only true legitimacy comes from the ballot box in a democratic election, and we haven't had one in 20 years, as I already mentioned at the start of this conversation, according to OSCE observers. And so I think it is very important, for example, that there would be concrete consequences after this so-called Douma election, that the so-called parliamentarians that are the product of this exercise are not recognized as legitimate parliamentarians, are not granted seats on the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, on the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. Because, you know, what's always amazed me is how, for example, the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, which is the largest pan-European parliamentary body, every European country is a member except for Belarus, and Russia is a member. And, you know, with the one hand, Council of Europe observers always assessed, not always, but since Putin came to power and began to do all these things that we're discussing, they assessed with one hand the Russian election as not free or fair or democratic. And then with the other hand, they voted to accept the credentials of those so-called parliamentarians and to sit them within the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. And we always ask, well, how is it possible if you say that it wasn't a real election? So obviously the people who are the products of this election are not duly elected parliamentarians. How can you then recognize their credential and sit them? So I think this is something that needs to happen after September 19th. We already seen the European Parliament make an important first step. They adopted a resolution over the summer, very clearly calling on the European Council and European Commission and European External Action Service to not recognize the validity and the legitimacy of the State Duma election if it's not held in free, fair, and democratic conditions. And we already know it won't be, regardless of what happens with the fraud. And that, by the way, has important ramifications also for the year 2024 and for Putin himself, because I referenced several times these constitutional amendments waiving Putin's presidential term limits that were rammed through under the cover of the pandemic last year. Well, unlike the many previous occasions when Putin tried to pretend that he's following the letter of the law, even when he violated the spirit, as he did, for example, by putting Medvedev as a placeholder president, quote unquote, when he was hit with term limits the first time back in 2008. Everybody knew Medvedev was a puppet. Everybody knew he didn't have even the power to appoint his own secretary. But on paper, there was another man occupying the position of president. So technically, they didn't break the law. They did with the constitutional amendments last year, because Russian law says the constitutional amendments have to be passed on merit individually, you know, say one on minimum wage, one on historical memory, one on whatever. They rammed together 206 constitutional amendments. Buried among them was the personal term limit waiver for Putin, and they rammed them through in a single yes or no vote. This is unlawful. Secondly, they have amended, which they're not allowed to do, the meaning of the first two chapters of the Russian Constitution. This is like your Bill of Rights that enumerate the main rights and freedoms of Russian citizens. These chapters are supposed to be inviolable, and yet they have amended them on the sly by putting articles in later chapters that directly contradict now chapters 1 and 2. So we have a self-contradictory constitution where one article says the exact opposite of another. So that's illegal number 2. Illegal number 3 is the way this farcical plebiscite was held to ratify these constitutional amendments last summer, with no campaigning allowed, with no independent domestic observers, with no international observers, with a week-long vote held in makeshift locations like shopping trolleys and parking benches and car trunks and so on, with no control over what happens to the ballots, the most fraudulent electoral exercise in the modern history of Russia. That's illegal number 3. There was a very important report by the Council of Europe's Venice Commission published in March that pointed to the illegality of these constitutional amendments. The conclusion is very clear. Putin's term limit still stands. And if he attempts to remain in power 1 minute beyond the end of his term on May 7th, 2024, this should warrant very clear policy of non-recognition, de jure non-recognition by Western democracy. So that's an important point to keep in mind for our future conversation. But back to the Duma election this year, I think there should be very clear non-recognition of any legitimacy and validity of this so-called vote. On the second part of Otto's question, why do we still participate? Very short answer is because this is the only opportunity we have, even with all the caveats and restrictions and the foreign agent label put on your forehead that I just mentioned and so on, but to still reach millions of people that otherwise in those 5 years in between those electoral exercises, we are unable to reach. And this is an age-old debate in authoritarian regimes, in authoritarian societies, of whether to boycott fake elections or whether to still use them to try to drive your message across to as many people as possible. There are tons of literature written on the subject, academic, political science, political. There are valid arguments on both sides. I'll be the first one to recognize that. But we come down always, most of the opposition in Russia comes down to the need to participate, to drive the message through, and as importantly, to give millions of our compatriots an opportunity without much risk, because, you know, for now yet, you're not going to be arrested if you vote for the opposition on the ballot, or if you spoil your ballot, which often has to happen if there are no opponents left. That's still a way for millions of people in Russia to peacefully and safely express their opposition to the Putin regime. You know, I always remember how I was struck by, several years ago, I was in Cologne in Germany, visiting the Gestapo Museum, the building that used to house the Cologne Gestapo in Nazi Germany. And one of the exhibits in that museum was a ballot paper from one of the many plebiscites that Hitler held in the 1930s about, you know, do you love and support our Führer and so on. And that ballot paper had a cross, an X marked next to the word 9, no. And I guess that's why it wasn't a Gestapo, because they were trying to work out who put in that ballot. And I remember standing and watching that ballot paper, and it really affected me emotionally. I was really struck by this, because I was looking at the ballot, and I was thinking that the person who marked that X next to the word no, maybe he or she didn't change the course of history, but that person made their voice heard, and everything that was happening in Nazi Germany on behalf supposedly of the entire people was not on that particular person's conscience. We want to give millions of our compatriots that opportunity to come in and mark that X next to the word no on September the 19th. That's why we're doing it, despite a full realization of what these so-called elections actually are in reality.
Vladimir, I want to ask you about history. I want to follow up on what you just said about historical memory, because as you know, one of the ways in which the Putin regime has been successful is in rewriting history and convincing the public that Stalin is not as bad as we thought, and so on. So we have these polls now that are so different from even 10 years ago, where Stalin is perceived favorably. Sergei Lavrov just made a statement about an attack on Stalin as an attack on our past. How important do you think this is for Russians to come to terms with that dark part of their past? How important is that for building a democratic, rules-based order?
Thanks for that question, Golf. I think it's actually the central issue. You know, there's a saying in Russia that our rulers like to control our past, not just our present and future. And it's been the case many times that you know, regimes that come to power in the Kremlin try to rewrite history and control history. And that's certainly what Putin is trying to do by the almost full-scale rehabilitation, not just of the Soviet period generally. I mean, we all know he called the dissolution of the USSR the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, and so on, but also of the Stalinist period itself, and of Stalin himself personally. I would remind you that one of the first things Vladimir Putin did when he became president of Russia back in 2000 was to return the Stalin-era Soviet national anthem as the national anthem of the Russian Federation. And again, as we've been already talking today, Russia is a country of symbols, and symbols like this matter. This was one of the first symbols he sent. I think the biggest mistake that President Boris Yeltsin made back in the early 1990s, during that short-lived period of democracy that we had in Russia, was in the end his refusal, or his inability, whatever the right term here, to fully come to terms with the Soviet past, and to do what other countries in Eastern and Central Europe did after the collapse of the communist pro-Soviet regimes in the late 1980s and early 1990s, which was to open archives, to conduct, you know, public inquiries or investigations or trials in many cases into what happened, to introduce some kind of lustration measures to make sure that the people who were perpetrators of these crimes would never be allowed to serve in government positions again, to make sure that the crimes of the former regimes are, first of all, made public, and secondly, publicly condemned by the state, to make any return to that totalitarian past impossible. This was done in different ways in the Baltic states, in the former Czechoslovakia, in the former East Germany, in Poland, and so many other countries. This was not done in Russia. There were some timid steps towards this. There was some partial opening of the archives in 1991, 92. There was a law passed on rehabilitation of victims on communist repressions and so on, but this was never done full scale. There were never any illustrations conducted. Needless to say, we now have a Soviet KGB officer at the head of our country. This would not have been possible if those measures had been taken. We never had a full reckoning, a full opening of the archives, the full public discussion and the full public understanding of just how grave the crimes were that had been committed by the communist regime and its secret services, the KGB, against our own people, the millions of people who were sent to their deaths or to their gulag. There was never any trials. There were never any truth and reconciliation commissions, as happened, for example, in post-apartheid South Africa or in many Latin American countries after the fall of dictatorships there and so on. I think this was the gravest mistake that President Yeltsin's administration has conducted by not, or has made, I should say, by not following through with that. And we are seeing the results of this today. It's unimaginable today that, there would be a leader of Germany, the Chancellor of Germany, who would go and openly praise Hitler, or who would try to rehabilitate that horrendous period in German history. It's just impossible to imagine. Or that you would have, the Prime Minister or the President of Poland openly praising what was happening under Gomulka or something. I mean, this even sounds absurd when I say this, because it's just inconceivable. And yet we're seeing this in Russia. We're seeing the current rulers, the leaders of the current regime, Golf, as you just said, openly praising Stalin, as Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov did 3 days ago in Volgograd. And as when given an opportunity to correct himself, he made it even worse by going aggressively against the journalist who asked this question. You saw this happen yesterday. And we are seeing this again. We have been seeing this from the beginning of Putin's regime. The national anthem was just one of his first major acts. But we have been seeing more and more of this. And I think in this sense, our past is directly connected with our future. We will not be able to finally turn the page on this totalitarian legacy unless we fully reckon with it, unless we fully deal with it, unless all those archives are open, unless all those crimes are made public, and unless the people who have perpetrated these crimes are held accountable. And this is something that absolutely will need to happen in a post-Putin democratic Russia, which will come. We do not know when or how. That's one of the impossible questions, as you know from Russian history. Nobody predicted the three revolutions, the major revolutions that happened in the 20th century, but it will happen because nothing is forever. And Mr. Putin's regime is not going to be the sole exception to that in the history of humanity. There will be a post-Putin Russia. And I think one of the most important tasks for us in that post-Putin Russia will be to make sure that that return to the authoritarian past is never possible. And for that to happen, we need to do those things, Golfa, that you asked about, the opening of the archives and the full reckoning of the crimes that not only the communist regime, but now this current regime is committing as well.
So we're going to go to viewer questions because we got a lot that came in. So let's try to squeeze in as many as we can. We'll alternate again, Golfo and I. The first one comes from Mackenzie Latham, and she asks about the popularity of United Russia. Do you think it's possible that some voters feel shame in stating their support for United Russia? Is it possible that the polls are not reliable in that sense? The flip side, of course, to that could be that people might be afraid not to express their support for United Russia.
Actually, David, that's exactly my response. If anything, political scientists in Russia call this authoritarian bias. When a lot of people give the expected answer. Look, just imagine you sit in your kitchen somewhere in Moscow, Krasnoyarsk, or Vladivostok, or anywhere, and you get a phone call, or worse of all, a knock on your door, and some stranger you've never seen before says, comes in and says, hello, I'm from a polling agency X. What do you think of Vladimir Putin? Or what do you think of his party? I mean, what are you going to say? What are a lot of people going to say, knowing the situation in the country and knowing that those who dare to oppose this regime are hounded and harassed and exiled and imprisoned and sometimes killed? People know this. And so that's the expected answer to give. Sure, I support these guys. So if anything, these polling numbers for United Russia, 26% nationally, 15% in Moscow, if anything, they're skewed in favor of United Russia. So I think the actual figures are even lower because a lot of people give the expected answer. Of course, now we have to counteract that with all the measures that the regime is going to take to ensure the high result for the ruling party. So as we mentioned already, the first two nights, when they can basically change the ballots. Also, I didn't mention yet, there's this new experiment with electronic voting, with several millions of people participating. What usually happens, and we've heard many stories like that already, you'd get, in an office or in a factory or somewhere, where people are in school, in a hospital, where people who work there are dependent on the state. The boss would come in. They first of all, they'd make everybody register for the electronic voting, and then they would call everybody in together, sit them in front of a computer, and as the boss would be watching, they would make people vote, quote unquote, the correct way. So there will be that. There will be all the usual administrative resources and so on. The compulsion, the fraud. So there will be, I think the end official result for United Russia will be higher than 26%, but that's not because their actual support is any higher. Their actual support is much lower, I think, than reflected in these polls. It will be because of these artificial measures to inflate the support. And one other thing I did mention that's important to mention, that is, of course, Aleksei Navalny's initiative on so-called smart voting. So this was an initiative that manifested itself probably most spectacularly in 2019 during the Moscow City Council elections, when you had a similar situation to what we're seeing now, where the strongest, the most prominent opposition candidates were removed from the ballot ahead of time. And so Navalny and his organization came up with this idea, okay, if there are no real opponents on the ballot, let's just pick some random guys, some spoilers or some candidates from smaller Kremlin registered parties and vote for them, not expecting any result after this, but just to send a message, as to how fed up people are getting with the Putin regime, that they're prepared to vote, for a chair if it was standing against the candidate of United Russia. And what we saw in 2019 was that in nearly half of the districts for the Moscow City Council, in 20 out of 45 districts to be precise, those technical spoilers and random candidates that Navalny pointed to won against pro-Kremlin candidates. And I think one of the biggest fears of the Putin regime today, as we approach September the 17th, 18th, 19th, is to see a repeat of that on the national scale. And I think this is the main reason for this enormous wave of repression that has been unleashed against Navalny himself, but also his supporters and his movement, because they're afraid of that. Because as the Moscow election in 2019 showed, even when they remove real opponents from the ballot, that still doesn't stop pro-Kremlin candidates from losing. In many cases to just nobodies, again, some random spoilers or technical candidates, because so many people are simply fed up with living under the rule of one man for more than 20 years.
Vladimir, I want to squeeze in a few really good questions from our students. So real quickly, how does the regime know who attended rallies? In what ways does Putin abuse COVID restrictions to enhance his authoritarian rule? And do you think that this fake election could actually spark a revolution?
Thank you for the questions. Very important questions, all of them. So on the first one, on how do people know? Well, they learn a lot from the Chinese older brothers, as it were. The video surveillance technologies are really proliferating. And just one example, actually, pretty recent, in April, when there was this latest round of nationwide rallies in support of Aleksei Navalny, I was at the rally in Moscow, tens of thousands of people. And we were really, well, shocked, even I could almost say, as to how peaceful everything went. I mean, other places where, like in St. Petersburg, people were beaten with, batons and electric shocks and were used by police and so on. But in Moscow, everything was really peaceful. And we were like, what is this? What's happening? Nobody touched us, nobody beat us. And then it began the next day. People started getting visits and calls from police with administrative protocols over the violation of the rules of public demonstrations handed to them, because there would be video surveillance. Well, first of all, there are a lot of social media, and a lot of people, first of all, don't hide the fact. I mean, I'm proud to say that I go to opposition demonstrations. That's not something I'm hiding, and that's true for a lot of people. But even if somebody is not necessarily publicly sort of, touting it, there are video surveillance technologies now. And actually, just yesterday, Sergei Sobyanin, the mayor of Moscow, has said that it will be implemented almost universally. Like soon you'd be able to, for example, use the metro in Moscow without a card or a ticket, because they would recognize your face, and that it will come up, the money will come out from your personal account. But that's the same way that they can identify people who took part in opposition rallies. So that's the answer to that. And the COVID restrictions, I think one of the one of the most glaring things here is the hypocrisy. I mentioned this example where, recently there was a massive concert attended by Putin to celebrate the anniversary of the annexation of Crimea, and they got 80,000 people, no masks or anything, rammed into Moscow's Luzhniki Olympic Stadium, and that was okay, no COVID there. But if you try to have an opposition rally, as Navalny supporters did, several of them now have been convicted for breaking sanitary restrictions. And actually, if you look at life in Moscow now, things are almost back to normal, which I think, by the way, is a good thing. As people get vaccinated, we should be back to normal. There should be some light at the end of this tunnel. I think this year and a half has been horrible for people. So I have no problem with that, but I have a problem with hypocrisy. And for example, you can go to a theater, to a cinema, to a restaurant, to a concert. That's no problem, but you cannot have a rally. That's the last thing that still remains forbidden in the city of Moscow, to hold any kind of demonstrations. And I've never seen an election campaign where you're not allowed to meet people, and that's what we have. So I think the biggest criticism of the sort of the COVID restrictions, or I should say, restrictions under the pretext of COVID that the Putin regime is introducing, is that glaring hypocrisy, and that goes as well for the sabotaging of the OSCE observer mission that we already discussed. That's of course also because always, it's COVID, we have to be really careful about it. So no independent observation of elections. It's the hypocrisy. It's the glaring use of this pretext to further their means. As for the last question about a revolution, again, I'm a historian by education, and I think one of the most impossible things in Russian history has always been to predict major political change. In 1904, Count von Plehve, the Tsarist interior minister, famously boasted of the need to have a small victorious war with Japan in that case that was supposed to solve all the domestic problems of the empire. I doubt he expected that just 1 year later, largely as a result of that war, didn't turn out to be so small or so victorious, Russia would be engulfed in our first revolution, and the Tsar would be forced to concede a parliament and press freedom. In the end of January 1917, Lenin made his famous speech to a group of young Swiss social democrats in Zurich, which he ended by saying that my generation will not live to see the decisive battles of this coming revolution. The revolution began in 6 weeks. And we just marked the 30th anniversary of our democratic revolution in August 1991, which I remember well as a child, but I remember well when one of the most repressive totalitarian systems in the history of humanity collapsed in 3 days. And nobody at the beginning of August predicted what would happen by the end. This is how things happen in Russia. So that's an impossible question to answer. Our job is not to predict, our job is to prepare. We believe that our main task in the pro-democracy opposition is to prepare for that inevitable moment of change, whenever and however it will come, because one of the biggest problems with these previous instances of major political change in Russia is how unprepared people were. And this is the reason for the mistakes, including that mistake, Golfo, that we discussed in terms of not fully reckoning with the totalitarian past that happened in the 1990s.
So let me squeeze in one last question, because unfortunately the time is just about out and it's gone very quickly, which is always the sign of a good session. It comes from an anonymous attendee, and ordinarily I would not pay attention to them, but this one I thought was both a tribute to you, Vladimir, but also an indication of how scary things have become in Russia. The person says that he or she grew up under the rule of Putin, born in 2000, wasn't politically aware and active until 2018, then saw your documentary in Tampa and started doing his or her own research. The question the person is asking is how to express my opinion or support the opposition in a safe way. I currently do not feel safe talking politics or posting about it on social media due to the fact that my family is still staying in Russia, which is an indication of how intimidating the environment has become there.
Well, thank you, David, and thank you for reading out that question. And actually, this is a perfect ending for our conversation, because the safest, in fact, the last remaining safe way to do what our listener is asking is to go on September the 19th, not the 17th, not the 18th, on the 19th, to a polling place. And of course, if our listener is outside of Russia, there are polling places that will be open at embassies, at consulates, at some makeshift locations too. In fact, if you go on the Twitter handle of Navalny or Vladimir Milov or any of the people on Navalny's team, they recently launched a website that shows the locations of polling places outside of Russia for those millions of Russian citizens who live outside of Russia. And this is the safest, again, the last remaining safe way to go out and express how you feel. about everything that these people have done to our country in the last 2 decades. And I recently had a friend call me up and said, I want to do this. I want to go and show that I'm against these guys. How do I know whom to vote for? And I said, well, you know what? This year is going to be really easy, because you take your ballot and you'll see a massive caps lock bold font message that this is a party of foreign agents. Those are the good guys. The Central Electoral Commission has really made it easy for us to get oriented this time. So I would urge not only our listener who posed this question, but all those people who are Russian citizens, who have Russian passports, whether they are inside or outside of Russia. This is the last remaining chance to have your voice heard. Go and use it.
So the advice is go vote, but not early and not necessarily often. So, okay, got it. Good. Vladimir, this has been fantastic. Thanks so much. It's always great to see you. I'm sorry it's virtual, but hopefully before too long in person. So thank you, my friend. Golfo, thank you for this partnership between USF and FIU. It's been fantastic. I hope we can do it again very soon. And Vladimir, we look forward to both of us welcoming you back to our respective universities. And thanks to all the viewers. We had a great turnout today. Terrific questions. Really appreciate everyone for turning out, and wish all of you a safe and healthy long weekend ahead, and safe trip to you, my friend.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Vladimir. Thank you, David. Bye-bye, everyone.